War has always existed in the world since the beginning of human civilization. It has become something so common and prevalent in our lives that we have become used to the tragedies it produces. Whether it be the American rebels versus the British Empire, the Vietnamese rebels versus the American Empire, or the war in Russia and Ukraine, war seems unavoidable. The seemingly unavoidable future doesn't stop people from warning us about the destruction that can come with future wars as human civilization becomes more technologically advanced day after day. We find these warnings and anti-war messages in a place that most would not expect, and that place is science fiction. George Lucas' Star Wars was released in 1977, and due to its success, many more movies, TV shows, books, and video games would be released in the future. Star Wars helped launch science fiction into the mainstream media. 4 years prior to Star Wars' release, the last American soldiers left Vietnam, who were overpowered by the guerrilla war tactics of the Viet Cong rebels. Lucas was born 1 year before World War II ended and was around 10 years old when the Vietnam War began. He grew up surrounded by war and times of uncertainty. Naturally, he was very opposed to war, specifically in his time, the Vietnam War, which helped inspire him to create Star Wars. In an interview with James Cameron, Lucas discusses his inspiration for Star Wars.
You did something very interesting with Star Wars, if you think about it. The good guys are the rebels. They're using asymmetric warfare against a highly organized empire. I think we call those guys terrorists today. We call them Mujahideen, we call them Al-Qaeda.
When I did it, they were Viet Cong.
Exactly. So were you thinking of that at the time?
Yes.
With that in mind, I want to discuss how the topic of science fiction is vast and varied. Science fiction can be a vessel that teaches us about the past wars to warn us about future wars, and can be a vessel to make commentary on war itself. Some sci-fi films, specifically Star Wars, use the genre to promote an anti-war message. A major question for this video essay is whether Star Wars succeeded in promoting its anti-war message. I will argue that it did, especially through the character Luke Skywalker and the creation of a clone army. Overall, it is crucial for audiences to listen to the anti-war messages in Star Wars and other sci-fi films. While many of these sci-fi films are about war, they create an anti-war message to warn the audience that it is critical that we break the seemingly never-ending vicious cycle of war. As I mentioned earlier, George Lucas grew up surrounded by war. He disliked war very much and only avoided being drafted because he was diagnosed with diabetes, making him unfit for battle. So he would fight the war with a more peaceful approach by writing movies. Lucas was slated to direct the film Apocalypse Now, which was about the Vietnam War, but things didn't work out and he ended up not directing the film. In an article written by Benjamin Hufbauer, he states, quote, "The Vietnam War, which was an asymmetric conflict with a huge power unable to prevail against guerrilla fighters, instead became an influence on Star Wars," end quote. In another article written by Dan Golding, Lucas is stated saying, quote, "I figured I couldn't make that film because it was about the Vietnam War, so I would essentially deal with some of the same interesting concepts that I was going to use and convert them into a space fantasy," end quote. Due to Lucas's distaste for authority and his disapproval of the Vietnam War, one can assume that his ideas for Apocalypse Now would not paint the United States in the most positive light, so he took a more marketable approach and translated his ideas into a science fiction story which became Star Wars. Nowadays, we know that Lucas wrote Star Wars with clear intentions to make it an anti-war commentary about the Vietnam War, but back in 1977, many people did not realize it. Daniel-Immerwahr writes in his published essay, quote, "In the case of Star Wars, the film showed how the Vietnam War was not just a military crisis, but an ideological one too. Lucas staged a frontal assault on the mid-century intellectual foundations of U.S. supremacy, and surprisingly, filmgoers loved it," end quote. This quote exemplifies how science fiction can be a vessel to make commentary on war. Star Wars is a movie about Vietnam without being one directly, so the audience doesn't necessarily pick up on it. The audience roots for the rebellion without knowing they are the Viet Cong, and root against the Empire without knowing that it represents America. Sci-fi can be looked at objectively this way. Not knowing what the movie represents lets audiences see what's going on without going in with preconceived feelings. This allows audiences to look objectively at the situation without wearing the US exceptionalism lens. I believe Star Wars did accomplish its goal in telling an anti-war message, so now that we know more about Lucas, his opinion on war, and his inspiration for Star Wars, we can discuss how it is a commentary on the Vietnam War and how it is an anti-war film. There are many examples of this throughout the movies and shows. In The Empire Strikes Back, Luke Skywalker goes to find a Jedi Master called Yoda, who lives on a swampy bog planet. Yoda was a general back in the Clone Wars and also led the Jedi Order in the days of the Republic. Now a hermit hiding from the Empire, you would never guess that he was the Jedi Luke was looking for. Before he realized he's already talking to Yoda, Luke says, "I'm looking for a great warrior," and Yoda responds, "Wars not make one great," which in itself is an anti-war message. Luke is young and arrogant at this time, which is common for younger people looking for glory through war, while Yoda is much older and wiser and has survived wars and knows that wars do not make somebody great, which is something he teaches Luke. In the final film in the original trilogy, Return of the Jedi, the rebels enlist the help of the Ewoks, who live on the forest moon of Endor. Endor in real life is the redwood forest in California, so it's a very dense forest similar to where the Viet Cong fought. The Ewoks also use very basic weapons like bows and arrows, slingshots, and other primitive weapons to defeat the Empire. The Ewoks and the rebels defeat the Empire and its organized machinery. They take down large AT-ST walkers with tripwire and logs and use literal guerrilla warfare to overwhelm the large and organized Imperial forces. The Empire has trained troops and what seemed like an endless supply of resources, but the ragtag Viet Cong rebels still manage to defeat and drive off the strong American Empire. It doesn't get much more obvious than that. Luke is the literal embodiment of anti-war. He surrenders himself to his father, Darth Vader, in an attempt to turn him back to the light side. Vader ends up getting to his emotions, and Luke embraces the dark side, cutting off Vader's hand and nearly killing his father. When the Emperor tells Luke to finish him off, he stops, throws his lightsaber to the side, and says,
"I'll never turn to the dark side. You failed, Your Highness. I am a Jedi, like my father before me."
This ultimately leads to Vader saving his son and killing the Emperor before dying in his son's arms. Luke only achieves victory after he refuses to fight, not following down the path of violence. It's love, not war, that allows Luke to win. This is very similar to the "Make Love, Not War" slogan, which was very popular around the time of the Vietnam War and definitely had an effect on Lucas and inspired this scene. Many more scenes will be discussed later, but just through this scene alone proves how Lucas was promoting his anti-war messages through this movie. He succeeds in telling his anti-war message through this one scene alone, where Luke chooses to love his father instead of hating him, preventing more destruction and ending the cycle of war. Star Wars has always been political. It's a main aspect of the prequel trilogy and has played a role in all of the films. Many US politicians and critics have interpreted Star Wars in the opposite way Lucas had intended. In an article written by Dan Golding, he discusses how many critics have taken Star Wars and say it's a conservative film that promotes war instead of how Lucas wrote it to be anti-war. Golding cites critic Dan Ruby, who makes the claims, in Golding's words, that, quote, "Star Wars essentially authorizes the reclamation of the images of the Vietnam War, the past used to insulate against the present, far from treating technology with the usual terror of the science fiction genre." Ruby argues that Star Wars uses speed and size as exciting new possibilities for conflict, end quote. It's no secret that Star Wars is an allegory for the Vietnam War, but it is not meant to promote violence or conflict, as Ruby states. The goal was the exact opposite, and that can be seen through the example I have already provided. In an LA Times article written by M.L. Kavanon, they state how, quote, "Literature and film have long sought to capture the realities of war, and in turn they have influenced thinking about war. There is a direct relationship between real war and real war," end quote. An example given is how after 9/11, the Pentagon and Hollywood science fiction writers and directors speculate about unanticipated attacks that could follow. And in 2016, Army Chief of Staff General Mark A. Miley said that they pay close attention to science fiction. Lucas told his anti-war story by defeating corrupt politicians who have too much control over the galaxy. Sound familiar? Well, it should, since many of the characters in Star Wars are based on real-life politicians. In a Time article written by Ryan Teague Beckwith, he lays out how, quote, "Politicians and activists use Star Wars to make their arguments, sometimes for ideas that Lucas disagreed with, and in the final blow, the movie's bad guys were embraced by the very types of people he was warning against." He backs this claim up with a quote from Lucas that reads, quote, "It was really about the Vietnam War, and that was the period when Nixon was trying to run for a second term, which got me to thinking historically about how do democracies get turned into dictatorships, because the democracies aren't overthrown, they're given away. Lucas based Emperor Palpatine on Nixon for these reasons. Lucas believed he was corrupt and would do anything for power, which is similar to Palpatine, who was given full control over the Senate in Revenge of the Sith, where he was able to destroy the Jedi Order and form the Republic into the Empire. The democracy was literally given away to him, just as Lucas says in this quote. Padme delivers the haunting line,
"So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause."
Lucas warned the public about these corrupt political figures he clearly made to be bad guys, and yet they embraced it. Dick Cheney was called Darth Vader. He would even play the Imperial March, which is Vader's theme, as his walk-up music and political appearances. Lucas responded to the Cheney-Vader comparison, saying, quote, "A promising young man who was turned to the dark side by an older politician," end quote. And this is what happens with Anakin and the Emperor in Revenge of the Sith. During an interview after the 2016 presidential election with Steve Bannon, who was Trump's advisor, had this to say, quote, "Darkness is good," he said, arguing it helps to distract political opponents. Dick Cheney, Darth Vader, Satan, that's power. It only helps us when they get it wrong, when they're blind to who we are and what we're doing, end quote. This is spoken like a true Sith Lord. All of these points can work toward crediting the claim that Lucas was successful in delivering his anti-war message. There was a flaw with making works of art like movies. Once it's out there in the world, people will take their own beliefs on what that film means and run with it. Cheney wasn't in office when Star Wars came out, and he still received the Darth Vader label. Many people see the anti-war message in Star Wars, and there are also people who don't. Through Lucas's background and inspiration for Star Wars, it is known that his film is anti-war, and it is difficult to make a film that is about war and at the same time write an anti-war message. But that is what makes Star Wars interesting. The duality of the two viewpoints is a point of contention, but overall, Lucas's main goal in promoting anti-war is still the message of the film, and that is recognized by many. If anything, the politicians' reference help prove the point that it's important to listen to the messages in sci-fi films, as many of them have themes of governmental corruption, but Star Wars did it in a way that makes it feel very real. Another science fiction film that has anti-war messages is Paul Verhoeven's 1997 film Starship Troopers. While this film is not as widely known as Star Wars, it still has elements of anti-war messages that hit close to home, quite literally since Earth exists in the movie. For those who don't know, Starship Troopers is a sci-fi film set in the future where humanity battles insectoid aliens. You are not born a citizen, and the only way to gain rights is through military service. It follows a group of young recruits in the military as they face intense training and then join the fight against these aggressive creatures threatening Earth's existence. The movie explores themes of fascism, war, and propaganda. While the movie is satirical, it still covers its themes in a serious way that promotes an anti-war stance. In David Roth's article for The New Yorker, he argues how the film shares a connection with modern-day America and how we are always at war and always practicing violence. Roth says, quote, "The world of Starship Troopers aligns with our moment in its wastefulness and brutality, and most of all in being so helplessly recursive," end quote. The film serves as a reminder that if the world keeps on practicing violence, it will lead to more war and infighting, becoming a repeating, never-ending process, which is an anti-war message that Star Wars covers as well. Remember that Luke broke the cycle of violence in Star Wars. The film features scenes where a news station plays propaganda on screen about military service and doing right by your community. Anyone can see the clear satire and uncomfortableness the scenes display. Michael Moresi brings up a good point in his article on Tor, a science fiction website, which says, quote, "Satirizing war, condemning war is easy. What's not easy is extending the tragedy of war beyond the politicians, beyond the world leaders, beyond those higher-ups that are typically held responsible, and laying some of that blame on our shoulders, us watching at home as well." He argues that Verhoeven uses a type of voyeurism, showing us places that we know on Earth in ruin and destruction through these military propaganda ads, making us see up close and personal the effects that may plague Earth in the future if we don't break the seemingly never-ending cycle of war. The way Verhoeven delivers his anti-war message is different from Lucas. Through dark satire, Verhoeven shows us a galaxy in constant war, but focuses on Earth as one of the planets in peril, while Star Wars focuses on a galaxy far, far away. It's ironic how the characteristics of villains in Star Wars exist in our real world in the form of politicians, while Starship Troopers shows us a future of what Earth will look like if politicians keep leading us down the path of destruction. Proving ever more clearly we need to listen to the anti-war messages expressed through science fiction films, or what was once fiction may become our reality. Another point that isn't brought up nearly enough is the Clone Troopers and Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, and most prominently, the Clone Wars animated TV show. The clones are artificially created flesh and blood, identical human beings being cloned from the bounty hunter Jango Fett. They all look the same, sound the same, and are bred to be soldiers for the Republic. They also have accelerated aging, so they become older quicker, so they can become soldiers quicker. They reach adulthood, which would be 20 years old in 10 years, and aren't designed to live more than 50 years. Throughout the Clone Wars TV show, the clones have names that they gave themselves instead of their normal identification numbers given at birth. They also develop their own personalities and characteristics that make them unique. Some have tattoos, different hairstyles, and just about anything to make them unique from each other. I'm sure you're able to see the problems here. These human beings were created for war and only for war. But what happens to them once the war is over? There were hundreds of thousands of clone troopers, and they were being created throughout the Clone Wars. Clones were slaves to the Republic. They fought for it because they were bred to do so. But after the war ended, they were hung out to dry by the Empire, who were recruiting soldiers instead of using clones. In the recent Disney Plus show, Obi-Wan Kenobi, we see a homeless clone veteran on the streets, begging for money, forgotten by the Empire he once served. Similar to how veterans are forgotten by our own government after they put their lives on the line to protect our country. A quote from Colleen Ettman in her essay for Pop Culture Studies Journal has this to say about the clones. Quote, "Neither army is seen as the equal to the fully developed characters of either the heroes or the villains. Instead, they are the cannon fodder that allows these wars to take place, a disposable, lesser-than group of individuals who can die and will die without having to take the time to be mourned." End quote. The fate of the clones is tragic, and their stories are still being told in Star Wars media today. I believe Lucas is making a point with the clones. He has had the idea since the 70s when Obi-Wan tells Luke he fought in the Clone Wars, but we didn't see the Clone Wars until the early 2000s with Attack of the Clones. I think Lucas is comparing clones to real-life soldiers. Soldiers go through rigorous training to become soldiers, all for the service of our country. We are grateful for soldiers as they risk their lives to protect ours. But you have to remember, Lucas narrowly escaped being drafted in the Vietnam War, where teenagers were shipped off to a faraway land to kill people. Put yourself in their shoes. The draft is still a very real thing in America, and the thought of another world war isn't as far-fetched as you may think. It's a scary thought, and it's possible Lucas saw the Vietnam soldiers as faceless clones being sent to a war they didn't have a choice to fight in. We know Lucas wrote the first 3 films with the Vietnam War in mind, and since he mentions the Clone Wars in the first film, he was likely thinking along these lines. This contributes to Lucas's anti-war message. The clones were shipped off to a war they were forced to fight in. You see the same faces on all of the clones, and when you see footage of soldiers shipped off to a war they were forced to fight in, they don't have the same faces, but their faces are lost in the numerous amounts of them there are. But just like the clones, every soldier had unique personalities and characteristics that often get lost in the midst of war. Lucas is using the clones as a metaphor for the unfair and untimely death of thousands of faceless soldiers who were killed in a war they had no choice but to fight in, which is another anti-war message. In conclusion, science fiction is a powerful vessel that allows us to learn about the past wars like Vietnam, to warn us about future wars that will bring further devastation to the world and its people. The anti-war messages brought up in Star Wars, such as Luke Skywalker choosing love over war, and the clones and soldiers forgotten by each of their empires, to Starship Troopers' grim look at a future where war never ends, are important in teaching us about our world leaders and our futures. Sure, Star Wars may take place in a galaxy far, far away, but if we don't learn from what these films teach us, we may not be as far, far away from our next war as you think.